My topic this morning is a little bit different. We're going to branch out and I'm going to try to actually teach you a little bit of medicine. It's going to be like a mini medical school, so I do hope that, and please raise your hand and let me know if I've gone too far or if it's way over your head, but also know that there are slides that are deliberately over your head to show you the complexity of the system that we're going to be talking about. And they're not meant for you to fully understand them because most of the medical community doesn't even fully understand them. So this is a very growing field right now. In the last, I'd say, 3 to 5 years, inflammation as a source of disease and as the root cause of disease has become much more front and center. And we also know that obesity is now considered a low-grade chronic inflammatory condition. So this is a topic that I think is going to gain a lot of traction and is going to be really important in the years to come in our understanding not just obesity, but the body itself and inflammation. And so when we talk about diseases, and I'm just going to use a personal example, my son has Crohn's disease, and that's an inflammatory bowel disease. And so understanding that in the context of how his body and his inflammatory response and his immune system is fighting his own cells, that's something that we still don't understand. And so if we did understand it, we could probably cure a lot of diseases. So that's really in the forefront of medicine right now. So we're going to start, these are the objectives that I've had for today. We're going to define inflammation and its role in our bodies. That's where we're going to get a little bit technical, but I hope it's still going to lay the groundwork for us to better understand this topic. We're going to explain the connection between the adipocyte, which is the fat cell, inflammation, and disease. I've always found it really interesting that we call fat cells, and that we also shame people and call them fat, because one has nothing to do with the other. And so I tend to use the adipocyte as in a description of the cell, because that's just more technical and more descriptive of what it is. So I may flip back and forth, but that's the intention. So we're going to also discuss how the ketogenic diet, and mainly beta-hydroxybutyrate, which is the ketone body that is the main ketone body we produce when we're on a ketogenic diet, will help to reduce inflammation and thereby reduce our risk for disease. Okay? So we're going to start off by defining inflammation. It's the body's natural response to injury, okay? We can't live without inflammation and our immune system. It is the way our body defends itself against outside invaders, infection, other noxious stimulus, that it recognizes as foreign or a threat, okay? It's a system that has evolved over hundreds of millions of years. Where we are today with it is not where we were hundreds of millions of years ago, but it has evolved over time and has become very complex to defend our bodies. It's very complicated sequence of events involving many different molecules and pathways happening all at once and in succession. And over the last 100 years, there's been such a rapid change in our environment, in the food that we eat, in the soil that we grow our food in, and our immune system has not caught up. It hasn't adapted. And so our physiological response has been to cause disease. And that's part of what we're going to be talking about today. So similar to what obesity causes, we could probably replace inflammation in the middle with obesity, but aside from obesity, inflammation in and of itself causes all of these diseases. So everything from cardiovascular disease and diabetes to cancers, inflammatory bowel diseases, kidney disease, liver disease, autoimmune diseases, things we thought just happened to us, right? Rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis. These are all autoimmune diseases. Asthma, osteoporosis, neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's. I don't know if some of you have heard the term type 3 diabetes, right? So Alzheimer's is now being coined as type 3 diabetes. And why is that? Because largely what we're going to find is that sugar leads to inflammation that then leads to disease. Okay? So this ties back to some of what Naomi was talking about before. Okay. So inflammation in a nutshell, there are two main systems in our body that are part of the immune system, the innate immune system and the adaptive immune system. And the differences between them are that the innate immune system, both are really complex, but the innate immune system provides immediate but incomplete protection against intruders. So it just senses an intruder and goes after it. Okay, it's not specific. It doesn't target a specific invader. It just reacts. It can't distinguish between a friend and a foe, and therefore it can wreak havoc on the rest of our body and the surrounding tissue. The adaptive immune system is much more specific and precise. It's controlled by our B cells and T cells, which are white blood cells in our bloodstream. Okay. And it has exquisite specificity, which minimizes the bystander damage. So it doesn't damage the surrounding tissue nearly as much as the innate immune system. And it's a tightly regulated system. And it also provides long-term memory for our body, so that if that same bacteria or noxious substance comes into our body, it has memory and can chase after it much more quickly than the innate immune system starting all over again. Okay? So this is meant to be very complicated. This is the slide that I was talking about that's going to be more challenging to understand. But we're going to walk through it really carefully and really just to give you an overall sense of what the innate immune system looks like. So you have this bacteria or injury up here. What it does is it gets under your skin, and it releases a bunch of these endotoxins, okay? These little substances called endotoxins, which generate these cells, or it actually activates these cells called mast cells. The job of the mast cell is then to release a whole bunch of chemicals called cytokines. And those cytokines are what then recruit everything else in the immune system to do its job. So those cytokines will then stimulate the smooth muscle, specifically in our endothelial, in our vascular system, so in our arteries, okay? It's going to stimulate the smooth muscle around the artery, and that's going to allow for what we call vasodilation. The arteries, that smooth muscle is going to relax, the artery is going to expand, and what that does is allow blood to rush to the area. That's going to be the redness and the heat that we experience when we get injury or when we get an infection, right? It gets red and hot. That's what that's causing. And then the endothelial cells, which are the cells that line the artery, they're the ones that line the inside of the artery, okay? Those are going to contract. They're going to kind of suck themselves in. And then suddenly there's going to be space between them. So normally they're right up against each other. And then they're going to contract in and of themselves, and they're going to create space between them. And what that allows for is fluid. So it's fluid from the bloodstream to travel into the tissue that's been injured. And that's going to cause the swelling. That's also going to cause pain, because as soon as we have swelling in that area, it expands the space. And that's what causes the pain, okay? We also have bradykinin, which is also going to cause some pain. So then you've got space between the endothelial cells, right? And all these substances from the bloodstream that are normally supposed to be in the bloodstream can access the tissue behind the bloodstream, right? They go into the tissue in the area where the bacteria has found its way. And what that will do is that they will, the increased permeability, or the space between those endothelial cells that's allowing those white blood cells to kind of roll through and come into the space, we get what we call monocytes and white blood cells, which are coming through the space, and they're now interacting in the tissue space, and they themselves are now producing more of what we call cytokines, which are more chemicals that are going to recruit even more inflammatory cells and cause even a bigger reaction, okay? So we'll just ignore phagocytosis. But basically, well, I'll tell you, what phagocytosis is, these cells, this neutrophil, which is a white blood cell, and this macrophage, which is a type of white blood cell that got into the space, will now eat up the bacteria, okay? They engulf it, they eat it up. The macrophage, this one, will actually express it on its surface. The neutrophil will break it all up and release the little pieces into the tissue, so that it can now activate another series of events, which is called an oxidative burst. And this is a release of free radicals. Who's heard of reactive oxygen species or free radicals causing disease, right? We don't want those things in our bodies on a long-term basis. We do need them in this situation because we got to get rid of that bacteria and we've got to treat the injury. But when this system goes awry and this system gets out of control and is constantly functioning and constantly releasing these cytokines and having macrophages in our tissue, it causes a serious amount of inflammation. And what that does is damage the local tissue and allow for disease to occur. Specifically, if we're having this happen inside an artery, what's happening is that we're setting the groundwork for heart disease. We're setting the groundwork for plaque formation. And that's how the inflammatory response becomes so involved in disease. Okay? Was that clear or was it? Okay. All right. Okay. So we're not going to go through the adaptive immune system, but I'm just going to mention it really quickly. So these are the little eaten up bacteria pieces that are called antigens that were released by the neutrophil. And this is the macrophage expressing those antigens or little pieces of bacteria on the outside of the cell. And this is just the way the body gets some memory cells so that in the future, if it encounters the same bacteria, it can fight much faster. Okay? That's what the adaptive immune system does. So in inflammation and in inflammation related to disease, we have activation of both the innate immune system and the adaptive immune system. And there are also other areas of the immune system that we're not going to touch on today because they seriously get more complicated, is the complement system and the cell-mediated immune system. All of these systems happen so they're so reactive and they wreak havoc on our body when our body is not just fighting a bacteria that we've been exposed to, like a virus or a cold or even a skin infection or something like that. That's what this system was designed for in our bodies. It's not designed to be active all the time. And that's what it's doing right now for a lot of people. Okay. All right, this is just for some comic relief after some medical school. Cute, right? Okay. All right. So this is just, this is looking at what the fat cell does. So when we have excessive fat cell growth, this actually will lead to overstimulation of the immune system. And specifically, it will actually lead to the fat cell itself starting to become an immune system of itself. And that's not necessarily the job of the fat cell long term, right? The jobs of the fat cell that we've learned over time are, one, to store energy. That's the primary job of the fat cell. But it's also, we know now, to be an endocrine organ. It actually does release a whole bunch of what we call adipokines, which are modulators of the metabolic system and the immune system. And when a fat cell when it expands too much, it doesn't function at its best. It's not going to do its job to the best of its ability. It's going to start actually wreaking havoc because it will develop a whole bunch of it will release its adipokines at an abnormal rate and an abnormal amount. So it activates the immune system, and this inflammation is actually going to it's going to damage the individual tissues depending on where that fat cell is. So it's kind of local damage. Okay, it also has systemic damage. All right. So as I mentioned, there are over 50 adipokines that have been identified, and they all have diverse roles. And you can see here, I'm not going to list them all. These are just all the adipokines that are released by the fat cells. And this is just what we know of today. This is a field that's expanding, and there's so many more that we're discovering all along, everywhere. One of the ones, I think the first one that was discovered is not on here actually, and that is, it is up here, leptin. Has everyone heard of leptin? Right? And so leptin was one of the first adipokines that was discovered just, I think, less than 10 years ago. And leptin's job is actually to sense our food storage and our energy storage, and to tell the brain when we have enough fuel on board. Okay? The problem is that a lot of people have developed what we call leptin resistance. And it isn't clear, we haven't really defined leptin resistance yet, but similar to insulin resistance, there are a lot of theories. And one of the theories is that insulin in our bloodstream actually blocks our brain from seeing the leptin. So if leptin's job is to tell our body when we're done eating, when we have enough fuel stored and we no longer need to eat, but insulin is blocking that, can you imagine, like, your body just never knows when to stop eating? It just feels like it constantly needs to eat. So it's never, like Dr. Perello was saying, it's never an obese person's fault that they're obese. There are severe and serious chemical interactions happening in their body that are out of their control. And so it doesn't help us to put blame on anyone or shame them. What we have to do is correct their diet so that they can actually improve these chemical signals. And one of the things that I tell patients all the time is, you know, if we just change first what you're eating, don't even worry about how much you're eating. Let's just change the quality of the food that you're eating. We're going to start to change those signals, and we're going to start to see that that leptin will have a chance to be heard by your brain. And then what naturally happens is people will naturally actually reduce their portion sizes because they're so satisfied and because the signals are all functioning the way they're supposed to be functioning. Okay? So leptin, adiponectin, interleukin-6, TNF-alpha are just some, and they have pretty significant effects on metabolism and insulin resistance. So not only is our immune system overactive and damaging tissues surrounding it, you know, surrounding that area, but it's also acting on metabolism and insulin resistance all throughout our body. Many of the adipokines are involved in promoting chronic inflammation, and they cause it's this perpetual cycle. Adipokines will release more adipokines. It's this constant cycle that keeps going, and so we have to break this cycle. Sustained nutrient excess, meaning overeating or even just having an excess in our bodies, not necessarily overeating, causes malfunction of this fat cell, this adipocyte, and wreaks havoc on the body. And like I mentioned earlier, obesity is now accepted as a low-grade chronic inflammatory state. Let's see, can I get this? Okay, so let's use heart disease just as an example, okay? I'm not gonna run through all the diseases. I could have, but time is limited, so. So normally our vascular endothelium, which is the lining of the blood vessel, doesn't have prolonged contact with white blood cells. Okay, white blood cells are the cells that fight infection. Everyone knows that, right? Okay, so white blood cells are the cells that fight infection. They travel through our bloodstream all the time, and they normally just, you know, mosey along like a lazy river. But when we have damage to the vascular endothelium, or we have increased exposure to cytokines behind that vascular endothelium, or that lining of the blood vessel, then you're going to see these white blood cells come into contact with that lining, that outside wall of the artery, much more often. And the other thing that happens is something called lipoproteins will also come in contact with the wall. Okay, lipoproteins. So everyone knows what cholesterol is, right? Okay, and does everyone know that cholesterol is a lipid, right? So what's a lipid? A lipid is an oil, right? So does oil dissolve in water? No. Our bloodstream is water. It's aqueous, okay? So if we had when we measure cholesterol traditionally in just a regular lab, we measure LDL cholesterol, HDL cholesterol, triglycerides, non-HDL cholesterol, right? Everyone's heard those terms. When we're measuring those, we're measuring what I call the cargo. And I say that because at cholesterol, if it was traveling through our bloodstream as LDL, HDL, triglyceride, it would be, or LDL or HDL, it would be like bobbing suitcases in a river, okay? Because it's a lipid. It can't travel through our blood that is water. So it has to be carried on what I call them submarines, okay? It has to be carried in a submarine where the outside is a protein and the inside is the lipid. And so that's called a lipoprotein. Now we, in medicine are so creative that we call it LDL lipoprotein or HDL lipoprotein. And if it's an LDL lipoprotein, it's carrying LDL cholesterol. Okay? So these lipoproteins are what's traveling through the bloodstream. It's not the LDL cholesterol itself traveling on its own, because it wouldn't get to its destination. So the LDL lipoprotein is what's traveling and can actually migrate into the tissue. Okay? And so when it does that, when the LDL lipoprotein migrates into the tissue and the endothelial cell is damaged and it allows that lipoprotein to come in and the white cell comes in, okay, then the white cells become macrophages, as I showed you before, and they proliferate, stimulating the immune response, right, from all those cytokines and everything. And then it engulfs the abnormal lipoprotein, kind of like, you know, swallows it up like a Pac-Man, okay? And that creates what's called a foam cell. And that foam cell is the hallmark of atherosclerosis, or rather the start of a plaque, okay? So right here is your monocyte or white blood cell. Right here is your lipoprotein. Here is your endothelial cell that's contracted, allowing space in between. And here's your monocyte traveling through and becoming a macrophage, and here it is engulfing the lipoproteins and creating a foam cell. At the same time, it's releasing a whole bunch of chemicals that are causing all the surrounding tissue to again become inflamed. And that's what the start of a plaque is. Okay? So this is how heart disease and inflammation are related. So what is causing all of this to begin with, right? Well, we know that increase of triglycerides in the bloodstream is going to activate our white blood cells. It's going to generate an inflammatory response and cause that leaky endothelium or contraction and lead to inflammation. And this leaky endothelium is going to actually activate more leukocytes. So where do triglycerides come from? What's the primary source of triglycerides in our sugar, right? Sugar becomes triglycerides. So this whole process is being generated by sugar. And not only that, it's now acting on the liver to produce more of what we call small, dense LDL, which is that nasty stuff that actually can fit through those little leaky endotheliums. If we have big, fluffy LDL molecules, they can't squeeze through in between those endothelial cells that have contracted. And this will cause a bunch of fat to deposit inside the tissue around it, and a bunch of fat inside the liver itself and cause liver disease and fatty liver. And it's also going to release a whole bunch of other things and cause oxidative stress, which is going to lead to insulin resistance and heart disease, liver disease, kidney disease, and bowel disease, all of which are worsened, not only cause inflammation, but also get worse with inflammation. So this is how all of this is connected, okay? And it all comes back to sugar and carbs, right? Because every carb that we eat ultimately ends up as glucose, right? Everyone knows that? Okay, if you didn't know that, that's a really important thing, because that's why we talk about carbs, not just sugar. It's one thing, like sometimes we do it step by step, right? First we have to take out sugar, then we can take out bagels, then we can take out rice, then we can take out potatoes. And sometimes it's a battle of, well, which potatoes? Can I have sweet potatoes? But eventually we get to the point where we realize we have to take out almost every carbohydrate, at least every obvious carbohydrate, and try to minimize that in order to minimize this whole process. All right, have I lost you guys yet? Okay, here's another funny one. They're just cute little. All right, so let's talk about beta-hydroxybutyrate. It's that, so when we go on a ketogenic diet and we convert our body into a fat-burning machine, because really that's our goal, right? And let's pause for 1 second and talk about why that's important. And I'm just going to use the example of even a marathon runner, okay? So let's take even your skinniest marathon runner, your Ethiopian who comes over and wins the Boston Marathon, right? That person, if they were on a ketogenic diet and they were fat burning, they would have access to 40,000 calories of fuel. right? Where? In their 2 to 4% body fat. Because our muscle, okay, so where do we normally get fuel for exercise if we're not fat burning? We get it from our muscle and our liver in the form of what we call glycogen, okay? We can store, even the most muscular people, can store probably a maximum of 2,500 calories in their muscle and their liver, okay? But we can store 40 to 60 to 80,000 calories of fuel in our fat. So in my mind, it makes more sense to tap into that than to try to keep my muscle and liver full of glycogen, which the best source is sugar, right? So if I'm gonna run a marathon, I don't wanna have to stop and eat. I wanna just grab a cup of water and run, okay? And part of the reason you don't wanna stop and eat on a marathon is because you're gonna be vomiting or having worse on the side of the road because your body can't tolerate it when you're doing that kind of exercise. Now, most of us in this room are not running a marathon, right? But at the same time, we want the same benefit. We want to tap into those fat stores as fuel because that makes us much more efficient. It allows us to be less dependent on this cycle of needing to replenish our fuel all the time. Because once you use up your glycogen, you have to replenish it, okay? So when we go on a ketogenic diet, we produce a fuel or a ketone body called Beta-Hydroxybutyrate. And that is the primary one. So there are 3 ketone bodies, but this is the primary ketone body that we produce. So let's talk about Beta-Hydroxybutyrate and what it does. It's the primary molecule in our blood when we're in nutritional ketosis. Nutritional ketosis is a state in which we're burning fat as fuel. It traditionally was thought of as just a carrier of energy from the liver to the peripheral tissue. But now we know that it's produced in the liver, well, we know it's produced in the liver from fatty acids mobilized from adipocytes. And it's a really great fuel for the brain and the heart. And it's actually a preferred fuel for the brain and the heart. It has a very strong anti-inflammatory effect and inhibits major inflammatory pathways and activates all of those pathways that we talked about. It's a very potent inhibitor of hydrogen peroxide-induced reactive oxygen production. So those reactive oxygen species and free radicals, it actually inhibits those. And it functions at the gene expression level. So it actually alters our gene expression to alter our immune response of the body. So it's a pretty powerful, powerful molecule. And so I'm going to use this study to just illustrate the effects of a ketogenic diet on inflammation. Okay, this was a study done in Indiana, actually, in conjunction with Stephen Finney and Jeff Volek, who have been one of the, some of the leaders in low-carb diets and ketogenic diets and using them for health. And they compared low-fat and low-carb ketogenic diets. I can't read that, on circulating fatty acid composition and markers of inflammation. And we're going to focus on the markers of inflammation.